Let's say that the client has responded to the proposal and there's been some back and forth, you've fine-tuned it, and now a proposal is approved. Sounds great in theory, but in practice you need to remember that this is not a legal document. Until a contract has been signed, the client is under no obligation to go ahead with the project, and you are under no obligation to go ahead with the project. Your reputation might take a hit if you step back from a project at that stage. I have stepped back from at least 2 projects at that stage as well, and sure enough, they weren't super happy with my decision, but nobody can force you to work. But nobody can force you to work on a project you don't want to work on unless you have a contract. Don't start working on the project until a legal contract has been signed by both parties. Some organizations, such as the Government of Canada, will insist on using their contracts, their contract template. You have some room for negotiation, but not that much. In many instances, they are not willing to budge on certain items, especially when it comes to intellectual property. You should never sign a contract that you don't understand or that you do not agree with, because once you have signed the contract, it is your legal responsibility to respect it. There are some exceptions, but those are usually written in the contract itself. We'll talk about this in a second. Having said all of this, I am not a lawyer and you are not a lawyer. Get legal advice from actual lawyers. I have a contract template. I never use it exactly as it. I change it depending on what the situation calls for, but there's a number of clauses that show up in these sections, and you'll see there's starting to be a fair amount of sections here. Perhaps you recognize some of those terms. You might not recognize some of those terms either. Take a look at the clauses in the sample contract. If you haven't done project work, you're unaware that things can go south pretty quickly. From their perspective, the client, there's only 3 outcomes that you can get from a project. We've talked about this before, but let me reiterate. If you've exceeded their expectations, which is usually done through the proposal and through open communication, then you get an A+. If you've met their expectations, you get an A-. And if you've failed to meet their expectations, you get an F. In the best case scenario, if you get an F, the client will just decide to send future projects to other consultants, or potentially will badmouth you to people who come to them asking for references on your work. The worst case scenario is that you've opened yourself to legal action because you did not meet your contractual obligations. Professional insurance against this eventuality is a must. And I need to tell you, there are going to be clients that are not satisfied with the project. Perhaps because they misunderstood what you were supposed to do or decided to try to get more out of the project than what had been agreed to, but perhaps also because you dropped the ball. You're not going to be hitting all of the high notes all the time. That's nearly almost impossible to achieve. Protect yourself. When it comes to intellectual property, you might ask who owns the results of a project. Most reasonable parties will conclude that the client owns the IP, and you might need to sign a non-disclosure agreement before a contract can actually be enacted. But who owns the methodology? Who owns the approach? Can you reuse the code that you use for one project for another project? Can you publish the methods? Can an individual consultant use a method she developed as part of a team for her own work? Does it make sense to patent mathematical, analytical work? Now, perhaps you're thinking to yourself, why are you asking these questions right now? We don't even have a project under our belt. But it's important to take the time to figure out how you would deal with these questions with your team and with the client beforehand. It could save you a lot of difficulties down the road. The goal there is to make the job as simple as possible by removing the focus on anything but the quantitative analysis.